Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update extra video, giving you extra information and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war. Where should we go to first? Well, the creator of the Rybar channel. So I use Rybar as one of my pro-Russian sources to get an idea of what the Russians think, and to pit that against what the Ukrainians are claiming and see where the truth is, and hopefully navigate my way through those disparate voices. Well, here the creator of Rybar channel, who now has a live TV program, admits that the Russian VDV forces, those are the airborne forces, crack forces, lost 50% of personnel, 40 to 50% of their personnel by September last year. This is a short interview, just a snippet, but well worth listening to. And I'll read it out to you for those who are listening to this and not watching the video. So he says, many are saying that you cannot see the airborne forces on the front line. Unfortunately, this is the objective reality. By the start of mobilization, our airborne forces lost 40 to 50% of the staff. As of now, out of the old and tested formations with designated equipment, not that many are remaining. And that's where it ends. Not that many. If I had 10 bottles of beer and I had not that many bottles of beer left, I would not have more than half my bottles of beer. I would have maybe 4 out of 10. So not that many remaining is not a good synopsis of where, and I don't know if that's the old and tested formations, whether he's just talking about VDV or whether he's talking about the Russian forces, the established Russian regular forces as a whole. I don't know. But this is a bit of a damning indictment of the situation of the Russian forces and the numbers that have been lost over time. We'll see a propaganda video later that one of the propagandists said, well, let's take a moderate figure of losses, 1 to 8, meaning that one Russian troop is lost to 8 Ukrainian, and that's his idea of a moderate figure. Well, this goes completely against that and fits more in line with what the Ukrainians have been saying and what people like myself have been saying for some time, which is the Russians have taken huge losses. They're just capable to sustain those losses because they've got a population that they can throw into mobilization. They've got a large army. You know, they throw people at the problem, but they are losing troops hand over fist, and that that is obviously a problem. Again, how much of a problem is if Ukraine was to lose that amount of troops, I would wager it'd be more of a problem for Ukraine than Russia. As I say, Russia just had the capability to, replace those humans with some ease. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later with a report from RUSI. But before we get there, Ukrainian troops destroyed 5 light engine boats with sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the Russian Federation in the area of the islands of the mouth of the Dnipro River. So the general stuff. I've seen some videos of Ukrainians dropping IEDs from drones on boats that have moored up. One looked like a lifeboat that you'd send off a ship, like an enclosed, what they called, there's a name for them. Bear with me. So it's a closed lifeboat, totally enclosed lifeboat. Might have even been a free fall lifeboat off a that you see dropping off a ship, or you can see. And the Russians appear to be using that for something, and they just dropped a bunch of munitions on it. But it took about 6 or so improvised devices to actually take it out, missing it slightly into the water and obviously not causing it too much damage, but it was taken out. And anyway, there is footage of this happening. They are trying to take out boats. Boats are no different to vehicles for kind of utility, just working in a different medium. It appears France, I don't know if this is like extra cannons, but this is an alert from French. The French have announced that they are sending 12 new cannons, Caesar cannons, to Ukraine, and that will follow on the back of $200 million assistance to them, and they are increasing their production capacity. Which is really good news. Caesar is a very good piece of kit. We know that Denmark are giving 16, and they are the 16 that they had. Well, they were due to be given, but sold by the French, and they are just redirecting them straight to Ukraine. This is all really good news for the Ukrainians. Kiev Independent. The UK government rules out sending fighter jets to Ukraine. The UK Prime Minister's spokesman said on the 31st of January, that's today, it is not practical to send British fighter jets to Ukraine as they are extremely sophisticated and take months to learn how to fly, as quoted by Sky News. Well, as this guy said below, we'll start training now and not in several months' time. Get ahead of the curve. I don't know to what jets this spokesperson is referring, whether it's Typhoon, Eurofighters. Well, they're never going to send them; they're too recent. It's more likely to be something like the Tornadoes, Tornado bomber, sort of fighter bombers. They are perfect for seed operations, I would have thought. Just from my limited knowledge of the Tornadoes, they were used the British up until Libya, I think, recently. They've been retired now. I would have thought perfect for sending to Ukraine. I know Germany have a bunch of Tornadoes as well that they're just starting to get rid of. So I don't understand why we can't just give them all our Tornadoes that are stored somewhere. And get them trained up on them now. Well, talking about the UK Army, Great Britain, and I'm going to have a bit of a sidebar here. I'm going to go off on a tangent, so deal with it. Great Britain has trained 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers and intends to train another 40,000 this year, the Telegraph newspaper reports, with reference to the representative of Downing Street. This has come on the back of... so this is the Telegraph article says, Army set for a budget boost amid concerns troops are overstretched by support for Ukraine. And I reported yesterday that the UK Army, apparently according to some US expert or some US Army anonymous person, saying that we're not a first-rate army anymore, basically underfunding, and it's that you're not as good as you should be, type thing. And probably exactly right. We have been underfunded for many years, and understandably so. In peacetime, you've got other things to think about. NHS, which is woefully underfunded. Education, which is woefully underfunded. I can tell you both those things from firsthand experience and evidence, and knowing people here and there. It is a bit of a problem. However, where do we find that money? Do we rob Peter to pay Paul? For example, so if we say, right, we're going to spend Poland 4% of, are they spending 4% of GDP now on, or is it 4% of budget? I think it's 4% of GDP, which is pretty big. So Poland spending that much on their armed forces. Okay, if we're going to do that sounds brilliant. If you're for our defense forces being built up to what arguably they should be, but that money has to come from somewhere. You don't suddenly magic it from nowhere. You need to increase taxes. You need to do this. You need to do that. However you're going to do it, stimulate the economy. Yada yada yada. Take it from education. Take it from pensions. Take it from healthcare. Okay, well, then you're screwing up another part of society, and that is going to annoy the heck out of your population, and that's going to be deeply unpopular. How do you fund this? We're struggling enough with our NHS, so we've got everyone's going on strike at the moment in the UK. We've got teachers going on strike, firefighters going on strike, nurses are on strike, railway are on strike. This is a sign that things are not going well in the UK, economically speaking, and the way that our government has been spending money or not spending money. The way that we've done it is austerity for the last 12 years, which is not spend money, but you need to stimulate the economy. This is the classic argument between, do you borrow and spend in order to stimulate and get more money in, or do you close down your credit card and stop spending money and make government smaller and smaller and smaller? And it turns out that no one's got any money, and there's no liquidity, there's no kind of stimulation of the economy, etc., etc. These are age-old discussions. However, you just look at our NHS and it's massively underfunded. So compared to the G7, we spend in the UK 20% less than most of the other G7 nations. I think we're the second lowest in the G7. Here's an analysis of how much we spend on our healthcare in the UK. Average day-to-day spending on health between 2010 and 2019, about £3,000 a person. So per capita, that's 18% below the EU 14 average, right? So that's the EU 14. That's below that average. UK spending per person, if it had matched the EU 14 average, then the UK would have spent an average of 227 billion a year on health, 40 billion higher than we have done. So, okay, a year we need 40 billion extra quid in the UK NHS to meet the average of what the Europeans are spending, right? So don't give me this crud that oh, we spend too much on the NHS. We spent so here's another and I'm going to rant because this really pisses me off that we think that we spend X, Y, and Z. You look at America, right? America has a private healthcare system, and it spends more per capita on healthcare as a government than we do by a country mile, right? In 2017, the UK spent about £3,000 per person on healthcare. And in the G7 group, that was the second lowest, with France spending 3,737, Germany 4,432. US spends £7,736 per head on healthcare per capita. In other words, they spend in a private system. Their government spends over two times what we spend in a fully subsidized universal healthcare system. If you look at something called the Commonwealth Fund, which looks at the top 12 countries in the world for healthcare, and we used to come out really well on it on a lot of metrics. The one metric we now come out top at is efficiency, which means doing the most with the least amount of money. Right. In other words, we're woefully underfunded, the NHS. So then to bring that back to make it relevant to this and defence and whatnot is okay. You're going to whack a bunch of money into the armed forces. Where's that money coming from? Then we have things like Trident, that's a nuclear deterrent, which is going to cost gazillions of quid. Do we need that? This argument then with Russia happening now, is that a greater call for Trident? But if Trident's this stupendous amount of money, could you better spend that money on retaining our nuclear deterrents as they are, and just putting that into our armed forces? All of these kind of arguments. But this would be the sorts of argument, just to make this relevant for everyone else watching, that every country is going to be happy. So Poland, yeah, that's amazing if you're all for defense and all of this, and you're all for reacting to this Ukraine war in a way that means there's going to be hopefully security going forward. And you say, right, Poland, well done, 4% GDP on defense spending. Excellent. Where's that money coming from? Because if you're Polish, you're thinking, yeah, brilliant, don't want Russia knocking on our door. Okay, who are we screwing over? Is that education? That healthcare? Are we doing the pensions in? Like, what's happening? Where's that money coming from? Or do we have like areas where we've been a bit funky with money? We're going to be less funky. Money doesn't grow on trees, but sometimes, we had all this idea that we couldn't spend this money pre-COVID, right? COVID came along, and suddenly our government were throwing money all over the shop. They were saying to the opposition party, the Labour Party at the time, money doesn't grow on trees. They're saying all this stuff, right? And saying, where do you think we're going to get the money from? Because Labour was saying, you need to spend more money on this, you need to spend more money on it. Where do you think we're going to get this money from? COVID happened, and suddenly all this money started appearing, and then everyone in the media and in the general public is going, hang on, it looks like money does grow on trees, because you said we had absolutely no money, and now you're throwing all this money around, and it turns out that loads of the top politicians in your party appear to be doing deals with PPE, and you've got £69 million in your husband's offshore account that's come from a deal that as a conservative peer, that's come from a PPE deal, a protective medical equipment deal, with a company that you've got your fingers in. Interesting. Anyway, all that kind of happened, and it turns out there was loads of money around. So on the one hand, is robbing Peter to pay Paul. On the other hand, there is money somewhere. We are rich countries. The UK is a rich country. We were fifth biggest economy. I think we're the sixth now. I think France have overtaken us. Anyway, whatever. Point is, we're all going to be all the countries involved in giving a load of stuff to Ukraine are going to be involved in having these discussions with their populations about where is the money coming from to support Ukraine, where is the money coming from to boost funding for your armed forces, given the heightened threat of geopolitical shenanigans and whatnot. So yeah, there's my rant about not enough money in the NHS. And if people say we put more than enough in, well, it's like, well, compare us to every other country you need to, and you see that we don't put enough in. So there you go. Uh, okay, Ukraine will receive from 120 to 140 Western tanks in the first wave of aid, said Minister of Foreign Affairs Dmitry Kuleba. So this is pretty good. They are obviously, wanting 300 tanks, and we talked about how there are all these different tanks being able to add up to perhaps 300 tanks in total when you take into account T-72s, those sort of being repaired, those being given by Eastern Bloc countries or former Eastern Bloc countries with Soviet hardware. When you're talking about Poland giving not just Leopard 2s, but their modernized Polish tanks, and all these other nations throwing stuff in, but the first wave looks like it's going to have 120 to 140 tanks. Obviously, that's going to be super useful for the Ukrainians. Right. RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, UK sort of think tank organisation, has brought out just now or a few days ago, a report, Russia Through the Kremlin's Eyes. Now, this is interesting. They've got hold of some polling somehow from some Kremlin polling, and they've written about this. I'll just quickly take you through a little bit of this. So the polling has tended to divide the Russian population into 5 broad categories. So this is from Russia, from the Kremlin's point of view themselves. So the five groups they see are cosmopolitans, nihilists, loyalists, globalist patriots, and hurrah patriots. So the cosmopolitans, constituting around 12 to 15% of the population, so that's going to be very much your kind of Moscow, St. Petersburg lot of the population, are viewed as forming the core of the active opposition, with just under half of this group assessed as having personal connections to Ukraine. The nihilists, comprising just over 10% of the population, are viewed as critical of the government, but largely disengaged and passive. This group is viewed as unlikely to be supportive of the cosmopolitan opposition. The remaining groups are all seen as supportive of the government, albeit to varying levels of intensity. If anything, it is the hurrah patriots at around 20 to 25% of the population that raise the greatest policy concern, as they are the most invested in the conflict and therefore the most likely to be critical of failures. Right, so this is what you're seeing in the military bloggers shutting down. So we've had Gerasimov saying, we're going to reform the army, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And he's come along and said, and we're also going to shut down the military bloggers from being critical of the MOD, which they have been. And so there's move towards censoring. I love it when pro-Russians have a go at me for being pro-censorship and stuff. It's like, you don't really understand what my views are on censorship anyway. They're pretty nuanced and quite complicated. All I'm saying is there's a sliding scale, and you've got to draw a line somewhere. At the one end of complete freedom of speech is utterly impractical, and no country on earth has that, and no human advocates for that. You might say you advocate for it, but you don't. You don't want your children going to school and getting their swearing in their faces. You don't want pornography shown at 2:00 in the afternoon on TV so your granny can see it, etc., etc. So we moderate, we regulate, we change things so people can't say and do what they like all the time. It's where you draw the line, right? So somewhere along there we draw the line. That's basically what I'm saying. There is no right answer, because all these things are conceptual, and we have to agree where we're going to draw, or don't agree, we just do it if we're all authoritarian, and we draw the line, right? If you're having a go at someone for drawing the line, if you're pro-Russian, having a go at the West for drawing the line here and not accepting, I don't know, Russia Today as kind of propaganda, as a propagandist source in Russia, then in Europe, then hang on, have a look at what's going on in Russia. I don't stand for this rank hypocrisy, because they've shut down every alternate viewpoint in Russia. There's no alternate media. They are now exiled presently in foreign countries and not allowed to report. You can't even say the word war. And now we've got the people being critical, who are ultra nationalists, who are being critical of the Russian MOD and their decisions, are being shut down by and having to toe the party line by the Russian MOD. So, for example, it looks like Rybar is partly, now being guided by the MOD. You have Syriac maps never mentioning Wagner in Bakhmut. Every single gain that is made by the Russians is the DPR and the Russian army, and never mention Wagner. So, yeah. So the greatest variation, they say, in categorization is among loyalists and globalist patriots, largely reflecting the level of engagement with politics. Anyway, later on, private polling since mobilization has demonstrated that the war is being more widely discussed and that a broader cross-section of the population are pessimistic, both about their own prospects and about the economic impact on Russia. Perhaps most contentious is the closure of the border, a measure that is seen as an extremely negative light across population segments. This growing pessimism has not yet manifested as a threat to the government, however. And this is interesting, and it goes on to talk about this in a little bit, that no one's actually criticised Putin. Everyone's criticising bits and pieces of decision making, the MOD, a bit of this, bit of that, but no one's gone for the Kremlin, no one's gone for Putin. The greatest concern registered in surveys is nuclear war, with respondents supportive of measures framed as a means of reducing the likelihood of nuclear conflict. Come on to this with a bit of propaganda in a second. Western leaders should note that Russian posturing over nuclear use is as much about raising domestic fears and therefore bolstering support for the government in diffusing these self-generated threats as it is about coercing Russia's adversaries. Right, this is fascinating. So when they talk about nuclear stuff, is it because they're trying to scare their population into being unified? When you see Russian MOD putting surface-to-air missile systems on top of roofs of high-rise flats in Moscow, they're not doing it because they genuinely think they're going to be attacked. They're doing it to say something to their internal population, to say something to the Muscovites. You know, everyone band together. We need to be singing off the same song sheet here. For now, Russia's URA patriots are vocally criticizing the conduct of the war, but their criticism is largely directed at certain commanders, local administrators' handling of mobilization, or even the attitudes of wider society. They have not yet turned their eye on President Vladimir Putin. This is a Rubicon that the Kremlin will be anxious to deter them from crossing. Once they do, then it becomes possible for those parts of Russia's elite who are most dissatisfied to begin exploring a world beyond Putin and to communicate other explanations for the disaster to the Russian public. The Kremlin appears comfortable for the time being that casualties on the battlefield will not force the URA patriots to begin narrowing their accusations of blame. So at the moment, they're willing to make the calculate, or they're willing to suck up those casualties, willing to make that calculation that people dying on the battlefield is not enough to send people over the edge, and therefore we can kind of keep doing that. So the picture painted through polling is one in which the Kremlin can sustain losses, but attempting to generate the national unity required to bring about a more favourable position on the battlefield and a more coherent drive to bring industry into a war footing would significantly increase the risks for Putin if setbacks continued. For now, however, the Kremlin appears to be comfortable with the domestic ramifications of protracting the war. So then there is this, and this is worth seeing in light of what I've just read to you. And I really want to play you this whole interaction. It's 8 minutes long, but it's one of the most important things I think I've seen on Julia Davis's translations of Russian propagandists. So bear with me. I am going to read it. It is fascinating. So here's a show between these different propagandists. You've got someone who's being vaguely rational, everyone else being mental, one of them being particularly mental, and you've got the host wearing a Z t-shirt, which kind of goes to show where he's at. So why are we advancing so slowly? This guy asks, and he is, I think, so this guy's a politician, and you'll see in a minute, and I go and watch it and listen to his voice as well. I mean, the guy is angry and he's advocating nuclear war. Anyway, sorry. Why are we still not in Kyiv? We should have been there a long time ago. Turns out not to be that way. You say we'll get depleted by the time we get there. No. We'll get depleted much sooner. If we keep moving in this manner, we are suffering quite serious casualties and are expending quite serious resources to take small towns. We have enough strength and resources, but the question is whether we will use them or not. Okay, first of all, this guy who ends up being mental is bang on here, right? Russia are losing a load of resources just to take small towns like Bakhmut, and that ain't, that's not good. And he recognizes this. So there is a kind of cutting through the propaganda to get a semblance of reality there, but then he takes it to an extreme level. I hope that we aren't discussing it in the media, but in reality, something is being prepared. In the best case scenario, by next summer, we have a prospect to destroy all of them entirely, to destroy the enemy completely. Yes, that's right. If we don't do this, then we'll keep fighting according to this scenario. We'll be fighting and getting depleted. So he's basically saying we'll keep losing troops like this unless we use a nuclear warhead. Okay. Well, then what happens if you use a nuclear warhead? It's not just going to be your troops that are going to get it. It's just wow. I mean, and the way he's saying this, I mean, it looks like he genuinely believes this. And then this guy, who's the most reasonable guy, but he does have to qualify his claims a few times to just make sure he doesn't get thrown out a window. If we use the resources that are being hinted about, says Alexei Chedev, I'm a political scientist. I'm not talking about nuclear weapons. There can be many scenarios, not necessarily nuclear, under which the direct conflict becomes real as opposed to solely hypothetical. Our limitations are not caused by playing somebody else's games, but by the fact that we also don't want a World War III or a nuclear apocalypse. This is the host now speaking. So he says, that's fair, but that means that according to your explanation, we unwittingly remain more within the framework of their scenario than Ukraine is within ours. So in other words, he's saying that if we continue doing, fighting the fight or even change the way we fight, we're playing to their rules. We are within their framework of how we do this war. And that's not going very well for us. So the political scientist comes back and says, it will stay this way until we start thinking strategically. And when we start thinking strategically, everyone else is shaking their heads. What should happen and change, in your opinion, says the host? Give an example. We need to make an offer to Europe, says the political scientist. We need to explain to them that in reality, they are the ones being robbed and impoverished. This is where he gets kind of angry and is saying things that are going to please the Kremlin. They are the ones being robbed and impoverished. They are the ones being turned into Ukraine. And then your lawmaker says, we should just tell them it will end badly. As a political scientist, you should understand, this is the host saying this now, that they're brainwashed to the point this is mad. That they're brainwashed to the point that they can't regrow any organs capable of understanding. Their organs of understanding have been chemically castrated. We shouldn't underestimate Europe, says the political scientist. I believe in Europe. That is the origin of culture and civilization. Like them, we are the descendants of Rome. It's a very sort of Eurocentric view. There is a Byzantine eagle on our emblem. Today, we are the bigger successors of the European culture than them. We are the only ones upholding European values, says the political scientist. And the host says, after you and I have said this in this studio, that right now we are the European culture, and smirking lawmakers, we oppose their anti-European, anti-culture. You say, I believe in them because the president said the sovereignty of Europe will be restored. That's what the political scientist said. He comes back and says, okay, hang on. Vladimir Putin himself has said the sovereignty, of Europe will be restored with Russia winning one of the. He says, I believe in that. He recently said that, and I agree. We are the ones who will restore it. Speaking as a boxer, this is what the host's saying. Speaking as a boxer, you're using a prohibitive move. You're hitting below the belt. This is fantastic. And this goes back to the RUSI report saying no one's dared yet to criticize Putin, because everyone knows if you criticize Putin, you're in trouble, right? And this guy says it brilliantly, this host. He says, you've used an illegal move there. When you cover up with the presidents, right? I go to the corner of the ring and stand still, because what could I do to you now? And this guy, Alexander Kazakov, who's a lawmaker in the Duma, chips in. He hasn't said anything yet. So, but that's I'll go on to that in a second. It's interesting that the host says you can't bring in the president because I can't say anything to that. Like they know they can't go against the word of the president and criticize the president. Anyway, Kazakov says there is a simple choice: either right now, in Solidar, Vuhledar, Mariinka, we'll chop these dirtbags up by tens of thousands. All these 10,000 will, as Pentagon tells them to, meet us in Kharkiv, a city of millions, and we'll be stuck there for about 100 years, like the cities in the Middle East. Otherwise, we'll have to demolish Kharkiv like Mariupol. Right, loads of stuff that's worthy of commentary here. So, A, he's admitting that Mariupol has been destroyed, demolished. It's been demolished, and that the Russians have done that. We'll have to demolish Kharkiv like Mariupol. And B, he's just called the Ukrainians dirtbags that they have to chop into pieces. Imagine in UK Parliament when we went to war in Iraq that anyone stood up and said, "Yeah, we need to go and chop those Middle Eastern types into pieces in Iraq and blah blah blah." It would be absolute pandemonium because the anti-war protest. Of course, you can't have anti-war protesters in Russia, but like that kind of language is so divisive, and you just wouldn't see it in the corridors of power in the UK and other sort of modern nations. At least I hope you wouldn't. But he continues, and then Vinnytsia, Khmelnytsky, and Lviv. He says, "Sure, if that's how you plan this operation, it's more beneficial for us to mince their army here, while at the same time preparing an offensive that is being discussed by our leadership." I understand about chopping them up, says the host. Are we not suffering any losses whatsoever? And this is interesting. So there's a bit of uncomfortable conversation where they're talking about, well, aren't we taking heavy losses? And this is what I refer you back to what I was saying earlier, the moderate estimation here. And he says right away. So this is a lawmaker, back to one of the lawmakers saying right away. He started coughing. If you believe the mid-range estimates, so he's talking about the host sort of coughing about taking losses. If you believe the mid-range estimates, our losses are compared to theirs 1 to 8. Even 1 to 8, that's also tens of thousands, says the host. So the lawmaker's saying our mid-range estimates are 1 to 8. Ukrainians are dying 8 times to our 1, right? And the host says, yeah, okay, but even at 1 to 8, that's still tens of thousands for ours, by the way. And then the other lawmaker chips in and says, secondly, this is just cynical. These aren't just the 200s and 300s, that means killed and wounded, but our warriors, our citizens. And this is where it starts getting really riled. So what? Says the other guy. To me, a slightly radioactive Ukraine is less important, says this angry lawmaker, than the lives of my soldiers. So he's saying like a nuclear apocalypse on Ukraine, killing all of the Ukrainians and poisoning them with radioactivity is less than the lives of our soldiers. That's the way it is, he says. It may be apolitical, but that's the way it is to me. And the host comes over and puts his arm on his shoulder to comfort him. We'll, because he's getting pretty angry here. We'll use nuclear weapons without response, says the other lawmaker. We'll bang them and they will just watch. So he's just saying, what, you think we're going to send a nuclear missile and no one's going to react to that? They'll just watch. And then the host says, unfortunately, as far as who is working according to whose plan, a slightly radioactive Ukraine unavoidably means a slightly radioactive Kursk, Belgorod, and Voronezh, these neighbouring areas. That's not a fact, says the lawmaker. And the other one says, otherwise we'll keep fighting and losing thousands. To take Zaporizhia, then we are storming the Dnieper in World War II. When we were storming the Dnieper in World War II, do you know how many we lost? How many? 400,000 fell just for the Dnieper. I don't want my children. So this is where it gets pretty funky again. So he's saying, one of these guys is saying 400,000 troops fell. I don't want to get to this situation where 400,000 troops are going to have to die to just take Zaporizhia, to just take a city. And then this other lawmaker says, I don't want my children to learn at school, to study at school, that we killed millions of people. And so you got two lawmakers arguing here about whether they should nuke Ukraine, and one saying we should because it's worth doing, because it'll save hundreds of thousands of lives. I guess you could see this similar as the atom bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the idea that no one's going to do anything about this is the point. And then this other lawmaker says, "Yeah, but I don't want to. I don't want to teach. I don't want my kids to learn that we've been nuking Ukraine. That's what we did. We killed millions." And he says, "Yeah. We're all for peace. That's great," says this lawmaker. And then we've got the political scientist saying, "Can I add two more words?" Alexei, you've already said about nuclear war. Let me respond now. If we strike the way you say, it will mean our defeat, a final and irreversible defeat. It would mean that everything they said about us is true. But if we manage to win with the resources that we currently have on the battlefield, that will be an honest military victory. I'm all for it, says a lawmaker. Yeah, I'm all for it. We will win instead of milling around for several months to take one tiny town. Alexei Alexandrovich, as I understand, says that from his point of view, and since he goes there often, he knows resources we're using aside from nuclear weapons are not all the resources we could and should use in order to achieve a fair military victory. Wow. So, how seriously do you take this stuff? Is this people throwing out ideas for the general public to see what is it calculated? I don't know. That guy, that white-haired guy with the beard, who was getting really angry, seems to really advocate for nuclear war. And if he's advocating for nuclear war, that is a huge, huge worry. You have so much to lose from doing that. For example, the lives of millions of people around the world, perhaps billions. I mean, if we're going into nuclear war, we could be talking about complete global apocalypse. So he seems to think that if they nuke Ukraine, it would just stop there and no one would react, and you would lose lots of lives in Ukraine, but you would save all the lives of your soldiers, even though your soldiers are actually going to be there. So I presume these might be tactical nukes. I don't know, but it's just a complete mess. And you're seeing that argument just play out on live TV in fascinating ways, troubling ways, and the idea that they've fully dehumanized Ukrainians and stripped Ukraine of its identity and its sovereignty and its right to self-determination, and they just see these as people you can chop up. It goes some way to explaining why they can advocate for such extreme measures as nuclear war. Anyway, that's me going through that video. It's a bit of a long trawl through translating that, and I'm sorry if it wasn't your cup of tea, but I think that's hugely important as a snapshot of the Russian way of thinking, certainly on these propagandist TV shows. Anyway, thanks for your support. Please like, subscribe, and share. I appreciate all your comments in the comments below. Toodle pips, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.